One of the most important points of consideration when choosing what perks to bring into a trial of DBD is recognizing how often a perk can be valuable or useful. How often a perk is valuable can heavily depend on a player's skill level, but overall there's plenty of perks that are one of the following: almost always useful or almost never useful. It's never fun to use a perk that only gets value once every several matches, but oftentimes the most underutilized perks only serve a purpose when very specific situations or instances occur, and thus why underutilized perks end up being so underutilized. However, there are times when underused perks get a glimpse of sunlight, and one of those times is when a new killer releases. With the release of a new killer comes new powers and perks to counter, and sometimes perks that were once relevant during an entirely different era of DBD become somewhat relevant again. The addition of Jason Voorhees, one of Dead by Daylight's most highly anticipated killers, has caused quite the commotion for a variety of different reasons. The most obvious reason is that Jason's omnipresent evil is one of the strongest mobility powers in the game. This part of his power allows him to quickly scout a map for any survivors that are not crouch walking, and thus being able to get the jump on survivors in the blink of an eye. This part of his power is not only intimidating, but it also gels very well with one of the most common killer builds in the game, with that being a Hex build. Thanks to how Jason's omnipresent evil currently works, he has a pretty easy time defending totems, and while survivors can normally cleanse totems without the need of an item or a perk, if a killer like Jason is using Thrill of the Hunt, or if a certain map has difficult to find totem locations, using a perk like Counterforce becomes an easy solution. This perk not only allows for a faster cleansing speed that stacks with every totem that is cleansed, but it also reveals a new totem location after finishing a cleanse. While this perk is not always useful in every match, it makes up for it with how extremely valuable it becomes when Hex builds do appear. But the power of Jason does not stop there. Thanks to how quickly he can move around the map and jump scare a survivor, it can be tough to judge in the moment if Jason is nearby. Some maps make it especially difficult as there's no grass showing visible movement, and having any kind of heads up notice that Jason is nearby is insanely strong and powerful, as it can mean the difference of getting a hit or escaping unscathed. And while a perk like Sprint Burst is normally a reliable perk for these kinds of situations, I wanted to think outside the box and not have to rely on an exhaustion perk. So when I was thinking of ways to reliably counter this part of his power, I remembered something. What about Spine Chill? After dusting this perk off, I tried it out in some matches, and honestly, I found it to be quite useful in countering Jason's power. The perk activates whenever Jason is both within 36 meters and has direct line of sight, so while using Spine Chill, it did allow for some early detections of Jason's presence that I wouldn't have normally known, thus providing an easy way to pre-run from Jason before he appears. The other great thing about Spine Chill is that there's essentially no cooldown. So unlike exhaustion perks like Sprint Burst that need time to recharge, Spine Chill provides a fairly reliable notice that allows for a head start in running away. And as great as it is to finally have a reason to use Spine Chill again, its usefulness is only temporary. Once the pick rate for Jason decreases, Spine Chill will go back to collecting dust. However, Spine Chill has other issues besides collecting dust. Spine Chill as it stands today is not only outclassed, but it also contains a major error in its perk description. Something that serves as a clear indicator to me of how much dust this perk has actually collected. But before elaborating further about the problems with the current version of Spine Chill, it's important to review why Spine Chill never collected dust in the first place. In the early days of DBD, Spine Chill was an overall nice comfort perk to have. Whenever the killer was within 36 meters of a survivor, Spine Chill would activate. And to be clear, it did not matter if the killer had a clear line of sight. It worked behind walls as well. So in a sense, Spine Chill was the original version of the visual heartbeat indicator that exists today. And because of how Spine Chill functioned back then, stealth killers and undetectable perks were easily countered. On top of this, Spine Chill's 6% speed boost would activate as well, with it being applied to a myriad of different actions like repairing gens, opening and exit gates, unhooking, and even healing. The real power from Spine Chill though came from the 6% extra vault speed that it granted. In fact, one of the most underrated perk combos in the early years of Dead by Daylight was the utilization of Spine Chill and Resilience, also known as the original vault build. Lithe can also be considered as part of that build, but the main objective of the vault build was to vault windows and pallets faster. The 9% extra vault speed from Resilience was sometimes good enough on its own, but when combined with the 6% extra vault speed from Spine Chill, and assuming both perks were active at the same time, a 15% faster vault speed was easy to achieve. The old version of Spine Chill, while fun to use, was probably a bit too easy to get value out of it, so naturally it did eventually get nerfed. The first nerf happened in patch 6.1, which coincidentally contained one of the largest amount of perk changes in a single patch. And then the most recent update happened in patch 7.1. And ever since these patches, Spine Chill has been stuck in a permanent state of being forgotten and borderline useless. In other words, Spine Chill as it stands today has no reason to ever be equipped. Outside of Jason, I guess now. But the issues don't stop there. Did you know that the perk description for Spine Chill is actually inaccurate? Yes, that's correct. Ever since the big perk description rework for patch 9.5, the perk description for Spine Chill states that a sound cue plays when the perk activates. This is not only incorrect, but also never how this perk has ever functioned. A similar perk that does have a sound cue play is Premonition, but that perk has a cooldown to its activation. And can you imagine for a moment if Spine Chill actually played a sound cue every time the perk activated? A survivor would end up being spammed with a constant noise during a chase, as the current version of Spine Chill only lingers for a half second and it has zero cooldown as previously mentioned. It's both crazy and borderline shameful that this perk description has been incorrect now for several patches, but I'm also not that surprised because its pick rate is probably so low that it's easy to overlook. And another issue that is hurting Spine Chill, and one that's not super obvious at a quick glance, is the introduction of the diminishing returns system. With how the current version of Spine Chill works, the 6% speed boost is essentially a joke. It's very uncommon to get Spine Chill value for more than a couple of seconds, so the actual 6% is borderline worthless. But then when factoring in diminishing returns, the 6% can be easily cut in half if another perk is being used that grants a larger value. From my perspective, I believe buffing the percentage to something like 10% would be a bare minimum requirement. This perk is already outdated, so why not make it a big risk versus reward type of perk? The risk of being in direct line of sight of the killer means that this perk should never be that powerful, as a killer is probably chasing you off a gen or something else before you can even get more than a few seconds of value from the speed boost. Altogether, Spine Chill being sort of relevant again, all because a new killer encourages slow and stealthy gameplay, is a truly convoluted way to throw back to 2016 DBD. However, why has Spine Chill been allowed to be left in the dust? There's absolutely plenty of perks that need buffs, nerfs, or complete reworks, but Spine Chill was nerfed with almost zero care for its future. Perhaps the perk is never destined to be useful again, and it's only meant to help inexperienced players learn the ropes. But if a perk like Deja Vu, which was a complete joke an entire decade ago, can be somehow buffed to an overall healthy, balanced, and useful status, why can't Spine Chill be given the same treatment? I think it's very much deserving of it. That's all I have for now. Thanks for watching.